What if a simple question about marriage laws could accidentally bind you to an alien queen for life? Earth diplomat Elias Mercer asked Queen Arlen about her culture's stance on marriage, expecting a diplomatic answer. Instead, her antennae shimmered with amusement as she declared, "I accept," triggering a sacred binding path neither can escape. Now they're trapped in a series of trials that could realign planetary relationships. How does one navigate an interstellar marriage they never meant to propose? Elias Mercer adjusted his collar for the third time, the starched fabric scraping against his neck like fine grit sandpaper. The coffee stain on his sleeve had spread from a small spot into a proper continent-shaped blotch, just enough to look unprofessional without being catastrophic. His mission briefing had been clear: salvage the tense negotiations with Queen Arlen using Earth's standard toolkit of charm, humor, and strategic concession. Small talk first, substance later. Keep it light. He entered the meeting chamber with what he hoped was a confident but not arrogant stride. The Allen throne room felt less like a diplomatic space and more like standing inside a living geode. Crystalline structures pulsed with soft light along the walls, and the air hummed with a low-frequency vibration that made his teeth ache. Queen Arlen sat perfectly still, her iridescent gown reflecting the chamber's glow. Her antennae, slender and expressive, twitched slightly as he approached. "Your Majesty," he began, falling back on the usual pleasantries. Weather, interstellar travel, the view from the palace observatory. Then, searching for another harmless topic, he asked about Allen marriage customs, just idle curiosity, something to fill the silence. Her antennae shivered, then slowly began to shimmer, catching the light like spun mercury. A slow, dangerous amusement warmed her voice. "An interesting question, Diplomat Mercer." In his ear, Barry's translated voice came through, dry and rushed. "Cultural landmine detected. Recommend retreat," but it was too late. On Alen, certain phrases about bonding aren't small talk, they're formal openings. Like knocking on a door that can't be unknocked. "I accept," she said, and the words landed not as a joke or a deflection, but as ceremony. The air in the room tightened, a visible ripple of energy. Gold and electric blue flowed from her throne to where he stood. It wrapped around his wrist like a cool, weightless band. He could feel it humming against his skin. Barry's voice cut in again, flatter than before. "Proposal formally acknowledged. Binding path initiated. No exit protocol available." Elias stared at the Queen, then at his wrist, then back at her. This wasn't a negotiation tactic. This wasn't a misunderstanding he could smooth over with an apology or a well-placed joke. The energy around his wrist pulsed once softly, like a second heartbeat. He'd walked in to talk trade agreements and mineral rights. Now he was locked into an ancient ritual with consequences that stretched between two planets, personal, political, permanent. His mouth went dry. The coffee stain on his sleeve suddenly felt like the least of his problems. Back in his quarters, Elias stared at the shimmering band around his wrist. It didn't hurt. It didn't weigh anything. It just was. A constant silent reminder. Barry's voice, usually confined to his earpiece during formal talks, now emitted from a small console on the desk. A concession to the new ongoing partnership status, as the AI had dryly put it. "The binding path," Barry began, his tone that of a patient but unimpressed academic, "is not a marriage. It is a pre-alliance compatibility framework. Think of it less as romance and more as a multi-stage job interview, with planetary consequences." Elias prodded the energy band. His finger passed through it with a faint tingling sensation. "So I didn't accidentally get engaged. I accidentally applied for a permanent interspecies merger." A concise if reductive summary. Barry displayed a schematic on the screen, a series of interconnected nodes, pulsing with light. The tradition predates written human language. It was designed to forge alliances between powerful houses, testing trust, resourcefulness, and emotional resonance through a series of ceremonial and practical trials. Completion signifies a bond strong enough to weather interstellar politics. Failure. Barry paused, a rare moment of dramatic effect. Failure typically results in a severance of formal relations, sometimes for generations. Queen Arlen's parting words, "Let the pact begin," now sounded less like playful banter and more like a judge pronouncing a sentence. The first trial, a simple exchange of vows in the geode throne room, had activated the initial seal on his wrist. There was no quitting now. His earthbound sense of humor, his go-to tool for deflecting tension, suddenly had to operate within a rigid framework of ancient ritual. A badly timed joke could literally sink a planetary relationship. The stakes were no longer about his career or even his personal comfort. Every move he made, every word he spoke, would be measured against the potential fate of two civilizations. A human misstep could close diplomatic channels for a century. An alien miscalculation could alienate a potential ally at a time when both sides needed unity. The binding path wasn't about them. It was about everyone else. This was the ultimate test of trust forced upon them by a linguistic accident. There was no script, no precedent for a human in this position. Every trial would be a first contact scenario wrapped in a sacred ceremony. The path had begun, and every diplomatic outpost, every interested government, every ship in the quadrant would be watching the feed. The universe had tuned into their very awkward, very public first date. The skiff sat on its landing struts like a silver leaf balanced on dew. Sleek, ceremonial, and utterly alien. Elias stood beside it, wearing formal Allen attire that felt less like clothing and more like an elaborate napkin arranged around his shoulders. The fabric whispered when he moved. Queen Arlen, in contrast, looked regal and utterly at ease in her own silver and crystal gown. The Allen court watched from a suspended gallery, their faces unreadable, antennae still. Barry's voice hummed in his ear. First trial, shared maneuver. The goal is coordinated flight. Suggestion: don't touch anything until instructed. Elias gave a tight nod. He'd piloted shuttles before, Earth models with controls that made tactile sense. This cockpit was different. The console curved like a wishbone, and the main directional array was a single seamless hemisphere that responded to palm pressure, not grip. Arlen took the left seat. He took the right. No instructions followed. So, he said, trying to keep his voice light. Which way is up? Her antennae twitched. The skiff decides that. You merely suggest a direction. He placed his hand on the control hemisphere. It warmed to his touch. He thought he understood the principle. Push forward to go forward. So he did. The skiff shot backward. He pulled back. They shot forward, then began to spin. Not a gentle turn. A full disorienting roll, the planet's surface and the starfield swapping places in a dizzying blur. You have inverted the directional logic, Arlen noted. Her voice remarkably calm as the G-force pressed them into their seats. A bold choice. Elias's earth-bred instinct was to fight the spin, to muscle the control back the other way. He clamped his hand down harder, worsening the tumble. The court above was a smear of light and color. His stomach protested. Okay, not bold, he grunted, his diplomatic tone cracking. Stupid. That was stupid? Perhaps, she said, and he heard the faintest thread of amusement. But committed. She didn't grab the controls. Instead, she rested her own hand beside his on the hemisphere, her fingers barely brushing his. The skiff reads intent, not force. You are shouting. Try whispering. He took a breath, forced his hand to relax. Instead of shoving the control, he thought about slowing. About stabilizing. He imagined the spin evening out. Her presence beside him was steady, a point of calm in the chaos. The skiff's wild rotation began to smooth. They weren't fighting each other for control, they were balancing. A little to your side, she said, her voice low. He nudged his palm. The skiff righted itself, still inverted, but holding a stable orientation. The ground was now their sky. Well, Elias said, his heart still hammering against his ribs. This is a weird view. It is traditional, Arlen replied. The first path often begins upside down. They hung there for a moment, suspended in silent agreement. Then, together, they guided the skiff into a slow, inverted glide over the palace spires. It wasn't graceful. It was hesitant, a series of small corrections and shared adjustments. But they were moving forward. The energy band on Elias's wrist pulsed once, warm and soft. A quiet chime sounded in the cockpit. Trial complete. He hadn't saved the day with a heroic maneuver. He just stopped making it worse long enough for them to figure it out together. The skiff's wild spin had been a pretty accurate summary of their entire situation. Somehow they'd found a way to fly anyway. No one was more surprised than Elias. The binding path was officially, irrevocably underway. The Grand Harmony banquet hall stretched out before them. A cavernous space where tables curved like river bends under a ceiling that mimicked a slow-moving nebula. Each place setting held far more utensils than Elias could name. and the center of the table was dominated by a shallow basin of gently steaming liquid that gave off a scent like ozone and mint. 92 courses. Barry's voice, a calm hum in his ear, informed him that the meal was less about consumption and more about cooperation. The food, it turned out, wouldn't just sit on a plate. The first dish arrived, a sphere of translucent jelly that quivered slightly. Elias picked up what looked like a pair of tuning forks. The sphere jiggled away from his approach. He tried again. It rolled toward the edge of the basin. "You know," he muttered, leaning toward Arlen. "This is the kind of thing my therapist would have a field day with. Trust exercises with dessert." Queen Arlen watched, her antennae angled in what Barry's live translation flagged as tolerant observation. She didn't interfere. She selected a different utensil, a slender rod with a softly glowing tip, and held it near her own serving. The sphere settled, then rose slightly to meet the tool. Elias stared. His own sphere was now hiding near his water goblet. "It responds to resonance," she said, not looking at him. "Not force." He blew out a breath, put the forks down, and picked up a simple spoon. He held it still, just above the recalcitrant jelly. He didn't try to scoop. He just waited. After a moment, the sphere trembled, then drifted slowly upward to meet the spoon's bowl. A small, quiet victory. He caught Arlen's glance. Something in her crystalline eyes sparked not amusement exactly. Something closer to recognition. The meal unfolded like that for hours. A broth that required a specific sequence of ladle strokes to become palatable. A fibrous root that uncurled only when sung to in a particular harmonic range. Elias's earthside instincts, stab it, scoop it, eat it, constantly clashed with the Allen need for ritual and patience. But slowly a rhythm emerged. He'd try his chaotic method, fail, watch her precise technique, and then find a messy hybrid that somehow worked. He'd make a wry comment about the absurdity of it all. She'd offer a single dry observation about human impatience. The food became a medium, a language. Each successfully coaxed bite felt like a translated sentence. Throughout, Barry provided a running commentary. Harmonic alignment fluctuating. Suggestion: less stabbing, more humming. A small holographic meter in the corner of Elias's vision ticked up and down with their progress, a constant, judgmental scorecard. At one point, Barry noted, "Side bet among kitchen staff now favors completion." Odds improved from 20-1 to 3-1 after the soup course. It was a reminder that this private trial was very, very public. By the 92nd course, a single, glowing petal that dissolved on the tongue with a taste of cold starlight, Elias was exhausted but strangely focused. The initial frustration had burned away, replaced by a dogged determination to see the thing through. He didn't look at Arlen as a queen across a negotiating table anymore. She was the person who knew which prong to use on the shifting cheese. A soft chime signaled the end. The energy band on his wrist warmed. Barry's voice cut through the fatigue. "Trial complete. Final compatibility score, 76 out of 100. Analysis chaotic methodology, but demonstrates adaptive problem-solving and grudging respect for formal structure. Prognosis promising." Elias looked down at the bewildering array of used utensils. He'd survived. They'd survived. Not with a perfect score, but with a functional one. He hadn't mastered Allen etiquette. He'd just found a way to exist alongside it with a lot of help. He met Arlen's gaze across the nebula-lit table. For the first time, it felt less like a stare-down and more like a shared, weary acknowledgement. They were figuring it out. The corridor wasn't made of walls, but of shifting light and shadow. A tunnel of liquid mercury that reflected nothing quite right. It was cool against Elias's skin, the air humming with a low psychic static. Barry's instructions had been sparse. Walk, observe, do not interfere. The mirror walk wasn't a test of skill, but of sight. Elias took a step and the surface beside him rippled. His own reflection stared back, but older. The man in the mirror stood behind a polished podium on Earth, receiving some gleaming metal. The audience cheered, but the Elias in the reflection had empty eyes, a polite smile that didn't reach his face. The applause sounded like rain on a roof, distant, impersonal. He saw a career of perfectly negotiated treaties that meant nothing to him. A life of winning for a world he barely connected to anymore. He looked successful, and utterly alone he walked faster. The image fractured, reshaped. Now he saw himself on a quiet beach, the kind of place people on Earth vacationed to escape. He was sitting on the sand, watching a sunset. completely by himself. The silence was absolute. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. This, the mirror seemed to whisper, was the other option. A different kind of solitude. He stopped walking, his throat tight. The diplomatic masks he wore every day felt paper thin here. He glanced at Arlen. She stood frozen a few paces away, her own reflections swirling around her. One showed her on a throne that shimmered with impossible light, larger than any he'd seen, crowned in constellations. She was magnificent, powerful, a queen of myth, but her face was a serene, unmoving mask, a statue. In another reflection, she was inside a beautiful, intricate cage. Its bars were made of light, shaped like her own crown. She wasn't struggling. She was just standing there, imprisoned by the very symbol of her power. Her antennae, usually so controlled, drooped slightly. She didn't look at him when she spoke, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. They crowned me at 15. My mother's ship was lost in the Kessel Drift. There was no body to mourn, just a ceremony to attend. She finally turned her head, and the regal composure was gone, replaced by a raw tiredness. For 10 years I have sat on that throne and wondered if I am just a placeholder, a symbol holding a space until a real queen arrives. The confession hung in the distorted air. It humanized her in a way the skiff or the banquet couldn't. This wasn't the alien monarch. This was a person who'd been given a crown too young and had been lonely under its weight ever since. Elias let out a slow breath, the images of his own empty future still flickering at the edge of his vision. Yeah, I get that. He ran a hand through his hair. My whole job is turning human messiness into clean professional agreements. I'm good at smiling when I'm bored, nodding when I'm annoyed. Sometimes I get back to my quarters and I'm not sure what my actual face looks like under all of it. He wasn't trying to be funny. For once, the humor was stripped away, leaving just the blunt, tired truth. They stood there in that corridor of their worst fears, and for a moment they weren't a diplomat and a queen. They were just two people who were very, very good at wearing costumes. A soft, clear tone echoed through the walk. The liquid metal walls solidified back into plain, cool stone. The visions were gone. The energy band on Elias's wrist pulsed, warm and steady. Barry's voice was uncharacteristically soft. Trial complete. Emotional resonance and vulnerability acknowledgement confirmed. Compatibility score 83. They didn't speak. They just looked at each other, and for the first time there was nothing to see through. No mask, no crown, no diplomatic shield. Just the person underneath. The exit door irised open ahead, spilling normal light into the strange corridor. They walked out together, not saying a word. They didn't need to. The silence said everything. The chamber looked empty. No furniture, no consoles, just smooth, pale walls that seemed to absorb the light. The air held a faint scent of clean metal and something else, like the quiet before a thunderstorm. Elias glanced at Arlen, who stood with her eyes closed, her antennae held perfectly still. He felt a familiar, nervous urge to break the silence. So, he said, his voice too loud in the hushed space, does this count as dating on your world? Because on Earth, most fourth dates don't involve psychic sensory deprivation tanks. Arlen didn't open her eyes. This is not dating, Diplomat Mercer. It is resonance calibration. You are attempting to measure emotional depth with a yardstick designed for small talk. Her tone wasn't cold, just precise. The purpose is to hold presence. With openness. Not to perform. He bit back another joke. The air around him shifted. The clean metallic scent softened, warmed, took on the bright, sharp note of a peeled orange. Citrus, amused warmth. It was his own feeling given scent. He looked at his hands, half expecting to see the color of it. A moment later, a softer, drier scent wove through the citrus, chamomile like tea steeping on a quiet afternoon. A gentle, nostalgic melancholy. That was hers. The two scents didn't clash. They mingled. The floor beneath their feet began to glow, a soft gold that pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm. He could feel the hum of it through the soles of his boots. He stopped trying to talk. He just stood there. He thought about the empty beach from the mirror walk, the hollow feeling of that solitude. He didn't fight it. He let the memory sit. The gold light flickered, dimmed toward a cooler blue, and the chamomile scent grew stronger. She was holding that feeling with him. Not fixing it, just there. Then he thought about the skiff, the dizzying spin, the moment they'd found balance. Not grace, but a shared makeshift stability. The light warmed back to gold, pulsing a little faster. The citrus note returned, mixing with the chamomile. It wasn't happiness. It was something quieter. Recognition. A shared understanding that they were both trying and that the trying itself meant something. The plain walls of the chamber seemed to breathe. A low harmonic tone filled the air, like a cello playing a single sustained note deep underground. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears so much as felt in your bones. The light on the floor stabilized, no longer flickering between colors, holding a steady, deep amber. The citrus and chamomile scents blended into a single, indefinable fragrance that was simply them. Their emotional states had synchronized, moving beyond the political necessity of the binding path or any flicker of personal attraction. This was simpler and more complicated. It was just alignment. A clear, soft chime signaled the end. The light faded, the sense dissipated, and the hum faded to silence. The energy band on Elias's wrist pulsed, warmer than it had ever been. Barry's voice was a calm, analytical presence in the quiet. Trial 4 complete. Emotional resonance and sensory synchronization confirmed. Compatibility score 89. A brief pause, the sound of data processing. Current projection for long-term alliance stability now sits at 64%. Probability of success remains conditional on avoiding future snack-based diplomatic incidents. Queen Arlen carried herself with a stillness that seemed woven into the very air around her. Her gowns shimmered, her crown sat perfectly balanced. Her antennae communicated in subtle, elegant movements that entire courts learned to interpret. She projected an image of unshakable royal confidence, a monarch carved from ice and starlight. The trials began to melt that ice, and what lay beneath wasn't weakness. It was the simple, unadorned weight of a person. It started in the mirror walk, where the illusions stripped away everyone's defenses. Hers showed a queen of impossible, luminous grandeur, a statue on a throne so vast it dwarfed her. And it showed her in a cage made of light, its bars shaped like the points of her own crown. The image was so potent because it was true. When she spoke, her voice lost its formal cadence. "They crowned me at 15, she said, the words flat, factual, heavy. Her mother's ship lost. No body, just a ceremony. A child handed a planet and told to rule it. For a decade, she explained, she had wondered if she was just a placeholder. A symbol keeping the throne warm for someone more qualified, more real. The crown wasn't just a thing she wore. It was a barrier. She feared it would keep her isolated forever, admired but never truly known. The binding path, for all its accidental and politically fraught beginnings, offered a crack in that isolation. It was a connection that existed outside the usual channels of petition and policy. It wasn't a subject seeking an audience. It was a person, however clumsy, standing beside her. Her playful "I accept" in that first meeting, a response that locked them both into this mess, now seemed less like a strict adherence to cultural protocol. It looked like a choice. A tiny, risky personal choice to engage with the one person who had, however mistakenly, asked a question that wasn't about trade or borders. It was a question about connection. She saw through Elias's defense mechanisms from the start. Where others might have dismissed his humor as frivolous or unprofessional, she seemed to recognize it for what it was, a shield. She watched him fumble with the ceremonial skiff controls, turning their flight into a chaotic spin. She observed his messy, impatient attempts to coax the banquet food. She didn't see a bumbling diplomat. She saw a capable man refusing to be cowed by a situation he didn't understand. His resilience, his stubborn refusal to quit even when he was clearly out of his depth. That was what she responded to. He treated her with a familiarity that bordered on disrespect, and in doing so he treated her like a person, not a symbol. By the time they stood in the synesthetic chamber, where emotions became scent and light, the shift was complete. The queen who projected unshakable confidence was also the person whose fear of loneliness carried the gentle scent of chamomile tea. She was no longer just the monarch bound by duty to complete the binding path. She was a woman actively participating in it, making her own assessments, taking her own risks. Her initial "I accept" had been the automatic response of a ruler to a formal query. Now every step forward was a quiet, personal reaffirmation of that same phrase. She wasn't just following tradition. She was choosing the possibility it represented. The crown was still there, but the person wearing it had decided to be seen. The hall on Issarat made the Elen throne room look cozy. It was a massive amphitheater-style space carved from dark, polished stone that reflected the light of 1,000 floating data streams. In the center hung the Velisar, The planetary AI, a complex core of shifting light and crystalline structures that pulsed with a slow, patient rhythm. The crowd was a mosaic of species, Alan dignitaries in their shimmering silks, human diplomats in stark black suits, and observers from a dozen other systems, all watching from tiered seating that climbed into the shadowed heights. The air hummed with the low thrum of countless whispered translations. Elias stood beside Queen Arlen. The energy band on his wrist felt heavier than ever, a constant warm reminder of the absurd chain of events that led here. This was it. The final trial. No more flying lessons or sentient desserts. This was declaration. He had to take that accidental, flippant question about marriage laws and turn it into something real. The political necessity of the binding path was a given. The personal part was the variable. He took a breath. The acoustics of the place made even a sigh sound important. I should probably start by saying this isn't how I pictured any of this going, he began, his voice carrying easily in the silent hall. A few of the human diplomats winced. It wasn't the formal opening they'd have scripted. I asked a question I didn't understand. You gave an answer I didn't expect. And then we spent weeks figuring it out. He glanced at the skittish banquet food, the dizzying skiff, the terrifyingly honest mirror walk. It's been the weirdest, most frustrating, most unexpected thing I've ever done. He looked at Arlen, then back at the crowd, and finally up at the glowing core of the Velisar. The binding path was an accident. But wanting us to work? That wasn't. I want this alliance to survive because it's smart politics. But more than that, I want it to survive because we can. Not as a treaty, as us. It was the least diplomatic, most honest thing he'd ever said in a professional setting. He'd essentially admitted the political project was now personal. He'd thrown his entire diplomatic playbook out the window. Arlen turned to him. Her antennae were still, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice clear and measured, but with a candor that matched his own. Power is a lonely discipline, she said, and the simple statement seemed to quiet the room even further. For a long time, I believed my crown was the only companion I was permitted. It is designed to isolate, to elevate. You, Diplomat Mercer, have a habit of hiding behind humor. She paused, and a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer ran along her antennae, but not entirely. I have seen the man who persists, who adapts, who listens. You have looked at the isolation and instead of bowing to it, asked it to dance. She wasn't just accepting his declaration. She was explaining her own. Her I accept had become a conscious, continuous choice. The Velisar above them pulsed. The swirling data streams coalesced into ribbons of light that wrapped around them both, not binding them but connecting them. Glowing script in a dozen languages scrolled through the air. Compatibility indices, emotional resonance scores, stability projections from Barry's own models. The light wasn't cold or analytical. It felt warm, like approval. A single clear tone resonated through the hall, felt in the bones more than heard. The ribbons of light dissolved. The Velisar's core glowed a steady soft gold. It was done. The formal political sign-off was complete. But it felt like something else. An affirmation. Then the crowd erupted. It wasn't the polite, measured applause of a diplomatic function. It was a cheer, loud and surprised and genuinely hopeful. The sound echoed off the ancient stone, a wave of relief and unexpected joy. You could feel the shift in the room. The tense, careful atmosphere of hard-nosed interstellar negotiation evaporated, replaced by something warmer, messier, and far more durable. The accidental proposal had just become a real alliance. Barry started as a tool, a translation program loaded into an earpiece, designed to turn alien syntax into something an Earth diplomat could work with. He ended the binding path as something closer to a referee, a therapist, and a deeply unimpressed witness to the universe's weirdest courtship. His voice, a dry, calm monotone, became the constant in a situation defined by chaos. He didn't just translate words. He translated context. When Elias asked his fateful question, Barry's warning of a cultural landmine was a masterpiece of understated alarm, delivered a microsecond too late to matter. His predictive models became their report card. He wasn't swayed by Elias's charm or Arlen's royal composure. He measured compatibility through a lens of pure data, heart rate synchronicity during the skiff's spin, biochemical stress markers at the banquet, the neuro-emotional resonance in the synesthetic chamber. He'd deliver scores with the detached air of a scientist reviewing lab results. 76 out of 100. Chaotic but promising. It was objective measurement of a deeply subjective mess. He saw the nuances they missed. He understood that Elias's joke about therapy was a deflection, and that Arlen's tolerant silence was a form of engagement. He registered the shift when their bickering over sentient food became a weird kind of teamwork. His commentary was a running analysis of their bizarre situation. He noted the formation of a betting pool among the diplomatic staff, updating Elias on the shifting odds of his own survival with the same tone one might use for a weather report. His warning about snack-based diplomatic incidents was a perfect capsule of Earth's cultural quirks, a reminder that even in the midst of sacred rites, humans are still fundamentally preoccupied with their next meal. He was never mocking, just observant. He provided the cultural scaffolding that kept their entire interaction from collapsing into a misunderstanding. His role evolved from a passive instrument to an active participant. His predictive models didn't just observe, they guided. A score of 83 after the mirror walk wasn't just a grade. It was a signal that their raw honesty had value. His projection of a 64% chance of long-term success was a data point that gave them both something concrete to hold on to in the surreal whirlwind. By the final trial, his analysis was woven into the Velisar's own validation process. The planetary AI didn't just approve their bond. It incorporated Barry's weeks of observation into its final judgment. The AI's approval and Barry's data became part of the same validation. When it was all over, Barry didn't become emotional. He didn't suddenly develop a personality full of warmth and congratulation. He remained what he always was, their dry, humored guide through impossible complexity. He was the one who had seen every misstep, every near disaster, every moment of genuine connection and had the logs to prove it. He was the unblinking eye that witnessed an accident become an alliance. In the end, his consistent, unchanging presence was its own form of reassurance. The universe was chaotic, communication was flawed, and people were messy. But Barry's data was clean. His analysis was clear. And in the silent hum of his processors, the story of how a joke became a bond was saved for good. Elias Mercer's humor was a blunt instrument. In the crystalline perfection of the Allen Court, his jokes about therapy and intergalactic dating etiquette landed like a wrench thrown into a clockwork mechanism. They were loud Earth-style deflections designed to keep things from getting too real. At first it seemed like a disaster in the making. The binding path was a sequence of sacred rituals, each step layered with centuries of tradition and unspoken rules. His approach wasn't just informal, it felt like a violation. But Queen Arlen didn't shut him down. Her antennae would shiver with that distinct, shimmering amusement. She watched his chaotic attempts to navigate her world's formalities not with disdain, but with a kind of clinical curiosity. His Earth perspective was a foreign contaminant, and instead of rejecting it, she seemed interested in observing its effects. The contrast was jarring, his loose, improvisational wit set against the rigid, ceremonial precision of the trials. It looked like a weakness. It turned out to be their secret weapon. The binding path itself, for all its ancient design, had a surprising amount of flexibility built into its core function. It wasn't testing for perfect adherence to Allen custom. It was testing for compatibility. Their odd dynamic, his jokes, her dry tolerance, the messy collaboration that resulted, became a new kind of data point. The universe, or at least the ancient system governing their progress, didn't punish their blended approach. It seemed to reward it. Their scores didn't drop when he cracked a joke during the tense mirror walk. Their emotional resonance actually improved. The system measured the result, not the method. Even the Velisar, the planetary AI that was the final arbiter of their bond, acknowledged the value of this unusual dynamic. Its analysis, delivered through Barry's dry commentary, consistently framed their progress in terms that valued adaptability over purity. A score of 76 was chaotic but promising. A 64% chance of long-term success came with a wry footnote about snack-based incidents. The AI's validation wasn't just a stamp of approval on their political union. It was an endorsement of their peculiar hybrid way of communicating. It recognized that the collision had created something new, and that the new thing worked. The resolution was quiet but profound. Humor and ritual stopped being opposing forces. They became complementary tools. His jokes softened the edges of the ceremony, making the terrifying weight of it manageable. Her rituals gave his humor a structure, a purpose beyond deflection. They found a rhythm where a well-timed quip could break a moment of tension, allowing a more honest conversation to happen beneath it. Their bond didn't form in spite of their differences. It formed because of them, strengthened by the friction of two worlds rubbing up against each other. The formal ancient path had been walked before, but never quite like this. It turned out the universe had room for a little improv. They stood on the terrace, the silver spires of Izarat's capital stretching out below them like a forest of frozen lightning. The air was cool, carrying the faint, clean scent of the alien atmosphere scrubbers. The formal ceremonies were over. The crowds had dispersed. For the first time in weeks, there was no trial to face, no audience to perform for, just the two of them, and the quiet hum of a planet settling in for its night cycle. Elias leaned against the railing, the polished stone smooth under his palms. He shook his head, a short, quiet laugh escaping him. You know, I keep thinking about what my mother's going to say. I'm supposed to call her, "Hey, Mom. Good news, I didn't get us thrown into an interstellar war. Bad news, I accidentally got married to a queen. She's gonna ask if there's a registry. I have no idea what to tell her." Queen Arlen stood beside him, her profile silhouetted against the star-dusted sky. Her antennae gave a slow, considering tilt. "Perhaps the universe simply rewards boldness," she said, her voice thoughtful. Then she glanced at him, and a shimmer of wry amusement passed over her features, or at the very least a certain variety of idiotic courage. The phrase landed softly, but it framed everything. Their entire journey, from that first catastrophic meeting to standing here on this quiet terrace, was encapsulated in those two words. Idiotic courage. His hadn't been strategic or noble. It was the courage of a man who didn't know the rules, who asked a question he shouldn't have and then, instead of crumbling under the consequences, decided to see it through. It was stubborn, messy, and entirely effective. He hadn't been brave. He'd just been too committed to the bit to quit. Her courage was different. It was the courage of a monarch who could have shut the whole embarrassing misunderstanding down with a word, invoking some royal prerogative or cultural exemption. Instead, she'd said, "I accept." And then she'd kept accepting trial after trial, choosing to engage with the chaos he brought instead of dismissing it. Her courage was in her openness, in her willingness to be seen, not just as a queen, but as a person who was also figuring it out. It was a quieter courage, but just as vital. The binding path had demanded both kinds. It required his stubborn, accidental boldness to get the ball rolling, and her deliberate, patient courage to keep it from careening off a cliff. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present. It was about embracing the accident and deciding to build something on top of it. The result was a shift in the gravitational pull between two civilizations. A change on a planetary scale, triggered by a series of events that could most charitably be described as a comedy of errors. Idiotic courage had somehow rewritten diplomatic policy, realigned foreign relations, and given two species a new blueprint for how to talk to each other. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. Below them, the city lights glittered. Above, unfamiliar constellations held their positions. The stars felt closer here, more like silent observers than distant points of light. They had witnessed the whole strange saga, from the first mistranslated question to this quiet moment of aftermath. They were still listening. Not for declarations or treaties, but for the simpler, quieter sound of two people deciding, without any ritual or requirement, to keep each other company in the silence. The binding path was over. This was just them, and for now that was enough. The political agreement was signed. The Velisar had given its approval. The formal part was over. What remained was the quiet, unscripted part. What started as a diplomatic catastrophe had become, against all odds, something personally meaningful. The binding path was designed to forge alliances. It had unexpectedly forged a connection. The shift wasn't marked by a ceremony. It happened in the silences between them. They had to navigate the move from political necessity to genuine choice. The alliance was a done deal, ratified by the highest authorities on both sides. Staying in the same room together was no longer required. They kept doing it anyway. The tests had revealed more than political compatibility. The synesthetic chamber hadn't measured treaty worthiness. It had measured them. The way his amused warmth smelled like citrus and her quiet melancholy carried the scent of chamomile. That wasn't about planets. That was about people. The way their emotional states synchronized into a single harmonic tone was a personal discovery, not a political achievement. The mirror walk had shown them fears that belonged to them as individuals, not as representatives. He saw a future of empty victories and quiet, solitary beaches. She saw a gilded cage shaped like her own crown, a lifetime of being a symbol and never a person. Those weren't political concerns. They were human and Alan ones. They were the deep, private insecurities that they'd each carried alone. Seeing them reflected back and then sharing them created a bond that no treaty could ever mandate. It was a choice to be vulnerable. Even the final declaration on Izarat, for all its public grandeur, became personally heartfelt. His speech wasn't a polished diplomatic address. It was an admission. He wanted the U.S. to survive, not the alliance, the us. Her response wasn't a queen accepting a proposal. It was a person acknowledging that she'd been seen and that she chose to see him back. They stood before the Velisar and a galaxy of witnesses and made it personal. The binding path required their participation. What came after required their desire. They'd passed every test. They could have gone their separate ways. The political pact secured, their duty done. They didn't. They chose to stay. They chose to figure out what came next. Not because a planetary AI was scoring them, but because they were interested. The resolution was simple. There were no more trials. No more judges. No more scores. The binding path was complete. Their actual relationship was just beginning. It was messier and more uncertain and entirely up to them. The political pact, with all its weight and consequence, had been the framework. The personal partnership was what they built inside it. It was quieter. It happened on a terrace under an alien sky, in conversations that weren't about policy, in the decision to simply share the same space without an agenda. The alliance would govern trade and travel and mutual defense. The partnership was about something else entirely. It was the thing they were building for themselves, under the same stars that had watched the whole improbable story unfold. The universe had given them a treaty. They were making it into a life. The binding path looked like magic, felt like ritual, but underneath it ran on hard science. Alan tradition wrapped advanced technology in ceremony, making the terrifying process of measuring compatibility feel ancient and sacred instead of clinical. Earth's scientific community, upon reviewing the initial data streams, hit a wall. They could measure brainwaves and biometrics, but the precision of the binding path's analysis was on another level entirely. It wasn't just observing data points. It was interpreting the relationship between them in ways human science hadn't yet conceptualized. Take the synesthetic chamber. To a human, it felt like a room that read emotions. In reality, it was a sophisticated neuro-emotional scanner. It didn't just detect that Elias was amused. It quantified the specific neurological signature of that amusement and translated it into a chemical scent profile, citrus. It measured the subtle shift in Arlen's neural activity associated with nostalgic melancholy and output the scent of chamomile. The harmony of the light and sound wasn't poetry. It was a real-time visualization of their brainwave patterns synchronizing, a measurable state of neural alignment that the system flagged as high compatibility. The mirror walk was even more complex. It didn't show random fears. It used a form of psychological projection technology that accessed subconscious neural pathways. It read the deep-seated anxieties both of them carried. Elias's fear of a successful but empty career, Arlen's terror of lifelong isolation within her crown, and rendered them as high-fidelity visual and auditory hallucinations. It was a brutal, efficient way to force self-confrontation, and more importantly, to see how each partner reacted to the other's deepest vulnerabilities. The system measured empathy, not just fear. Even the seemingly absurd banquet had a firm scientific basis. The food that needed coaxing wasn't just being difficult. Its cellular structure was engineered to respond to specific biochemical and energetic cues. The junqua, the utensil or harmonic tone, triggered a change at a molecular level, making it palatable. The trial wasn't about table manners. It was a test of patience, observational skill, and the ability to learn and adapt to an alien system together. All measurable indicators of long-term cooperative success. Barry's role became crucial because his predictive models had to incorporate these alien scientific principles. His constant scoring wasn't arbitrary. He was integrating data from the neuroscanners, the biochemical sensors in the banquet hall, and the psychological projectors, running it through algorithms based on Allen relationship science. His dry commentary about snack-based disasters was a cover for some incredibly complex number crunching. The final approval from the Velisar was the ultimate data analysis. The planetary AI didn't just rubber stamp their union. It processed the entire data set from every trial, cross-referencing it with historical records of successful and failed bonds from centuries of Allen history. Its glowing approval was a planetary-scale statistical confirmation that their specific combination of chaos and calm, humor and ritual had a high probability of lasting. The resolution was a quiet revolution in xenoscience. The binding path's successful completion proved that science and tradition weren't opposites. On Allen, they were the same thing. Earth's scientific community, once baffled, now had a new direction. Teams began poring over the data, not to debunk it but to learn from it. The focus shifted from trying to explain it away to trying to understand the new scientific language it spoke. They stopped asking if the process was valid and started asking how they could measure emotional connection with that same precise, unflinching clarity. An accidental proposal had just given human science a massive, unintended upgrade. The risks of cross-cultural missteps were no longer an abstract concept in diplomatic training manuals. They were now public record, a case study playing out in real time on interstellar feeds. A simple, well-meaning question about marriage customs had triggered an irreversible chain of events. Elias Mercer had walked into a tense negotiation armed with Earth's standard charm offensive and walked out bound for life to an alien monarch. The line between casual conversation and formal commitment, so clear on Earth, was dangerously thin elsewhere. Other diplomats across the galaxy watched the coverage with a new professional dread. They started paying closer attention to the footnotes in their cultural briefings, the sections on high-risk conversational topics suddenly moving to the top of the list. The binding path itself was the ultimate safeguard against casual commitment, but that was the problem. It had no off-ramp. Once the ceremonial energy sealed around Elias's wrist, the course was set. There was no option for a polite retraction, no cultural reset button to press. The fate of planetary relationships, trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, centuries of future cooperation, suddenly hung in the balance, resting entirely on whether two strangers could achieve personal compatibility under immense unnatural pressure. Elias's accidental proposal wasn't just an embarrassing gaffe. It was a potential diplomatic disaster of the highest order. A single failed trial, a moment of irreconcilable disagreement could have severed ties for generations. Their eventual success didn't erase the near miss. It highlighted the immense pressure they were under. They weren't just navigating alien rituals. They were doing it with the full knowledge that a misstep could have interstellar consequences. Every awkward moment in the skiff, every fumbled utensil at the banquet, every raw confession in the mirror walk carried that extra weight. The situation became a stark lesson in the need for better preparation. Diplomatic corps on Earth and elsewhere quietly began overhauling their first contact protocols. The new training modules included extensive immersive simulations of alien cultural practices, with a heavy focus on the specific weight of language. The era of diplomats winging it with charm and a smile was officially over. Their story became a dual-purpose tool in diplomatic circles, a cautionary tale and an odd sort of inspiration. It was the ultimate what not to do example, a masterclass in how a single sentence could upend foreign policy. But it was also proof that even the worst possible start could be salvaged through perseverance, mutual respect, and a willingness to learn. It showed that deep compatibility could be forged under fire, that two people from utterly different worlds could find common ground. The resolution was a new, widespread understanding that in interstellar relations words are never just words. An accidental commitment made in a moment of cultural ignorance carries the same weight as a carefully considered one. There are no takebacks when entire civilizations are watching. The story of the accidental proposal became a permanent fixture in diplomatic training, a reminder to choose your words with care, because out among the stars, you might just be agreeing to more than you know. They stood on the terrace, the vast silent sprawl of Iserat's capital below them, the unfamiliar starfield a dense spray of light overhead. The formal noise of the day had faded, leaving behind a quiet so deep Elias could hear the faint hum of the city's power grid, a sound like a sleeping machine. It was just the two of them now. No audience, no Velisar, no Barry chirping scores in his ear. The binding path was complete. The pact was sealed. In the sudden absence of all that ceremony and scrutiny, the space between them felt both smaller and infinitely larger. What had started as a personal catastrophe, a political time bomb built from a single mistranslated sentence, had somehow expanded to fill the sky. The stakes were no longer just about whether they liked each other or could tolerate each other through a few weird tests. The energy band on his wrist was cool and inert now, its job done. Its work remained. Their accidental bond had become a bridge. The personal connection they'd forged, however reluctantly, now represented a concrete possibility for their entire civilizations. Two worlds that had eyed each other with cautious suspicion were now, for better or worse, linked by this one strange story. The binding path had tested more than just their ability to fly a skiff together or coax a stubborn piece of alien food. It had measured something with wider implications. It tested their capacity for trust across a vast cultural divide. It measured their willingness to be vulnerable in front of each other, and by extension, in front of everyone watching. The ancient Allen ritual wasn't just about matchmaking. It was a stress test for interstellar diplomacy itself, and they had, against all odds, passed. Their union mattered because it proved such a connection was possible. That idiotic courage Arlen had named, his clumsy, stubborn persistence, her deliberate choice to engage with the chaos, hadn't just been effective. It had in some way aligned with a deeper pattern. The universe, vast and mostly indifferent, sometimes seems to tilt toward genuine connection however it arrives. It doesn't care if the start is graceful. It only seems to care that the effort is real. Their bond wasn't significant because it was perfect. It was significant because it was real. It was messy, improvised, and built on a foundation of pure accident. And that somehow made it stronger, more true. The consequences of that single moment on the terrace rippled outward, far beyond the two people standing on it. A personal choice to keep standing there, to share the silence, to choose continued companionship after the requirements were met, sent a signal. It told both their worlds that this was more than a political necessity. It was a personal commitment. That kind of choice has weight. It has gravity, so the stars kept listening. They weren't listening for declarations or treaties anymore. Those were signed and filed. They were listening for the quieter things. The sound of a human joke met with the soft shimmer of Allen antennae. The shared silence over a city asleep. The simple ongoing work of building a life together from the pieces of an exploded diplomatic incident. The universe had given them a treaty. What they built on top of it was entirely their own. And the stars, it seemed, were deeply interested in the construction. Elias Mercer's accidental question proved a simple truth. Even idiotic courage can spark real change when it's rooted in a genuine connection. Their story reminds us that the most significant bonds often begin with misunderstandings, not grand gestures. The trust they built under extreme pressure didn't just save a diplomatic mission, it realigned two worlds. It suggests the universe might just reward those willing to lean into unexpected commitments, whether they meant to make them or not. Sometimes the best foundations are laid by accident, then deliberately chosen every day after.